SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. As part of that goal, we have partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. SBP has 5 interventions: building efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy changes and improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. We ask that you please join us for our future webinars. The links to register will be available in the slides we send out later today. Additionally, we have an upcoming disaster housing course in February. If you are interested in attending, please reach out to me for more information. Social media is one of the easiest ways to keep up with what the advice team is doing, so we ask that you follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Now I will pass it over to our Director of Business Development and Partnerships, Joe Boyce.
All right, thanks, Maria. So we're going to spend a bit of time today talking about leadership and decision-making in disaster recovery. And on our next slide, those of you who have attended any of our courses or seen some of our webinars, you may be familiar with this house model that we like to show off. And this basically tries to encapsulate everything that's required to have a successful CDBG DR housing program. And you'll see at the very bottom of that, we have a foundation of leadership and decision-making, which then feeds into your overall strategy. So I think in the work that I've been doing with SBP over the past several years, we've had an opportunity to work with a number of different organizations and figure out ways to streamline their processes. And as government leaders, we oftentimes tend to lean on our technical expertise, and we're real comfortable in navigating all of the technical components required for these grants, all the federal cross-cutting requirements and whatnot. And what we've seen is those that struggle most tend to have a tendency to rely on technical and often ignore the adaptive skills that are required to have effective organizations. So that's having strong leadership and the ability to make decisions in a timely fashion. So I think the content we're going to cover today hopefully helps you to reflect on your organization and how you're approaching executing your programs. Next slide, please. So just to get us started, the basis of all leadership and influence is trust. I want you for a moment to think about an effective leader that you've had an opportunity to work for or work with, or that you've seen some of the traits and characteristics that made them an effective leader in your eyes. Was it that they appeared to be assertive in their decision-making? They created an environment where you could feel safe to make mistakes or try your best at what it is you're trying to do? Is it someone that you could confide in? Is it somebody who just seemed to have a strong sense of character? There are certain qualities that make a leader, and a lot of us tend to think that these are kind of traits that you're born with, but the reality is, with enough study and discipline, I think that you can develop leadership skills necessary to have an effective organization. So when we talk about building trust, on the next slide, there are two major components with building trust. It's the character that you have. So trying to think about those examples of effective leaders that you've encountered throughout your life, trying to be the leader that you would want to follow. And then also having judgment, which is the ability to make decisions and come to sensible conclusions. Disaster recovery is very complex, and it requires a sound strategy. And all that strategy is a series of hard choices that you're going to have to make over the course of your program. So having good judgment and strong character are critical to a successful program. Next slide, please. This often gets tricky. Many folks tend to think leadership and management are one and the same when the reality is they are two very distinct uh, elements that are required for organizational effectiveness. On the next slide, we'll break down what the differences are between the two. So, a basic definition of leadership is merely the action of leading a group of people or an organization, whereas management is the process of dealing with or controlling things in order to achieve defined objectives. So, we lead people and we manage things. It's important to remember that distinction, and I think it will help you as you work to navigate the process. Next slide, please. Ultimately, we're asking leaders to do several things when it comes to the outcomes of leadership as well as the outcomes of management. And on the next slide, we'll go over what those differences are. The outcomes of management are pretty simple. We're really only looking for effectiveness and efficiency, and we'll define those in a little while. But when it comes to leadership, we have three major outcomes that we are seeking. We are looking for purpose, we are looking for motivation, and we are looking for direction. And I would argue that one of these is more important than the other. When we're talking about the work that we do in the context of disaster recovery, we don't really have to lean too much on purpose. Most of us are in this work because we have a strong public service belief that we're doing the right thing, and we have the outcome of helping someone get back into a safe, sanitary, and secure home. So when we talk about leadership in the context of disaster recovery, purpose is not the absolute most critical of those three outcomes. When it comes to motivation, we have two types of motivation. We have intrinsic motivation, which basically means that I do my job because I want a sense of pride and I enjoy doing that. That intrinsic motivation goes hand in hand with the purpose-driven work that we're doing in disaster recovery. Now, the other type of motivation is extrinsic motivation, and it's pretty straightforward. It's money. So if I need to motivate someone more, I pay them more to do a better job, in theory. But I would argue that the most important outcome of leadership that effective leaders provide is direction, because you have to have a clear focus on what you're trying to achieve as an organization. And it's up to the leader to provide that direction and focus on outcomes to get those results. Now, if you provide the outcomes of leadership as well as the outcomes of management, you will oftentimes have much more clarity in communication as well as unity of effort, which are absolutely critical to having a functional organization. Next slide, please. Here are the general functions of management. Now, we said management is the action of managing things. So these are things such as your policies, your organization as a whole, your planning functions, the direction of your different units within your organization. And our outcome that we're seeking to achieve with management is effectiveness and efficiency. So effectiveness is the degree to which something is successful in producing the effect that we want. And efficiency is how well we can get to that outcome by using the least amount of resources to achieve the best possible outcome. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of practical application from a leadership perspective? Next slide, please. Your number one role as a leader is to do three things. It is to reduce unpredictability, uncertainty, and ambiguity. The more you're able to do these three things, the more the people that work in your organization are able to focus on the job that they need to do without having concerns that, well, Senator Jones is really angry that we haven't fixed Mrs. Smith's house. But if the leader is able to kind of reduce all that uncertainty and keep a lot of those rocks from being thrown at your staff, you'll be much more effective. Next slide, please. So there's a reason why we need to try to reduce these things. And we're going to answer our question on the very next slide. If we're able to reduce unpredictability, uncertainty, and ambiguity, then we should generally see an increase in all of the outcomes that we are seeking: purpose, motivation, direction, effectiveness, and efficiency. So what's this look like in real life? Next slide, please. If you have a low amount of purpose, motivation, and direction, you'll see that you're in that bottom left quadrant there. You tend to have an incredibly high stress organization, which is low performing. Now, as your purpose and motivation increase, but your direction still remains low, it's not quite as stressful, but you end up with a lot of frustrated managers who feel like they want to do the right thing, but they don't exactly know what it is they're supposed to be doing. As you have an increase in direction, but you still have little purpose or motivation, you end up with a stressful organization where your employees are frustrated because they know what it is that they're supposed to do, but they don't really care why they're going to do it. So you just have folks that are showing up to get a paycheck. Now, under an optimal organization where you have high levels of purpose, motivation, and direction, you tend to have much lower stress and a far more effective performing organization. Some key to achieving this is having direct communication, having your communications built into your policy, and just trying to be as open and transparent as possible so that everyone understands what's going on in your organization. It's very easy for all of us, particularly if we're in very specific functional roles, to kind of bury our heads in the sand and just focus on what it is that we're trying to do. But it's your job as the leader to let every cog in your operation understand the widget that you are producing. A really effective tool that we used in the South Carolina program back when I worked there is every time we would complete construction on a home, we would try to get our new staff members out to the event that we called the key turnover. I think if you see the fruits of your labor of that person who has been disaster impacted getting back into their home, it's an incredibly effective tool to keep the staff motivated and understand why their role is so important in the big picture. Next slide, please. So ultimately, your job as a leader is to decrease your workplace stress. And by doing that, you should inevitably increase communication. You'll have more productivity. You'll have a much higher level of trust within the organization, allowing your employees the flexibility to be creative in their approaches. So you'll continuously be looking to improve your processes because they might have some creative ideas about how to do things better. And you will have a far better employee retention rate. This work is incredibly stressful. So under the best of circumstances, the more you can do as a leader to decrease that stress, the more you're going to be able to keep your folks around continuing to do that great work. Next slide, please. So how do we get to all this? Ultimately, we're trying to have a strategy, right? Leadership is about developing a strategy and sticking to your strategy. And strategy is nothing more than using a number of different ways through means to achieve an end state. So when developing your strategy, you want to try to think with the end in mind. What does a successful recovery operation look like? Can we visualize that end? More importantly, can we describe what that end looks like? If you can't describe it, there's no way for you to direct your employees towards that end state. When we talk about means, we're really thinking of the resources that we have available: money, people, and time. Generally, in a business operation, one of the largest obstacles is a lack of funding. All of us as CDBG DR grantees don't have that problem. So now it's just using the funding that HUD provides to you as effectively as you can to find the right people. And then it's on you to design the ways to get to that end state. So you want to make sure that you are having means and methods that will ultimately solve your problem. Your solution needs to be feasible. It's something you can do, suitable, it makes sense, acceptable. Everybody's going to go along with it. Is it worth it? You don't want to be wasting effort on something where you're not getting a valuable outcome. And you want to make sure that you're operating in ways that are moral and ethical in nature. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned earlier, strategy is nothing more than a series of hard choices as you work through this process. So with that being said, hard choices are going to require you to make decisions. And decision making is important because if you're not deciding things, someone else is going to decide it for you, or your program is just going to kind of meander in the wind. So it's critical that you as a leader are able to make decisions. And we're going to talk a bit about what it happens whenever you make bad decisions on the next slide. So, oftentimes we can get overwhelmed in this work and we stop thinking and we make bad decisions. We tend to take a reactive approach rather than a proactive approach. Um, Many times we'll make bad decisions because we're fearful of trying something new, or we might not have the confidence to make good decisions. And when I say a good decision and I say don't be reactive, I don't mean that you need to take forever to make a decision. You can have a well reasoned decision that takes place over the course of 20 seconds. There's a great kind of anecdotal example of this where there's a gentleman who runs a manufacturing plant, and he has, a $2 million piece of equipment that stops working, and he can't figure out why. So he finds this 30, year veteran of the engineering world who comes in and kind of takes a stethoscope out, and he listens to the machine for a minute, and then he just taps the machine with a hammer in one little spot, and it fires right back up. And he tells the guy, that's going to cost you $10,000. And the guy says, well, let me get an itemized invoice for that. And he says, hammer tap, $1. Knowing where to hit the machine, $9,999. So you'll build up the capacity to make quick decisions the more you make those decisions. Point being that you can have what may appear externally a reactive decision that is still well reasoned and thought out based on your individual experience as you work through this process. Now we're going to talk a bit about a couple of different fallacies that we want to try to avoid when we're making decisions. Next slide, please. So there are three major enemies of decision making that many organizations end up guilty of at one point or another. The first of these is what's called impact bias and catastrophic thinking. I want you to think back to maybe your first love. You're maybe a teenager, young adult. You were madly, deeply in love, and then you had your heart broken. You thought your world was going to end, right? A little bit of time passes and you realize, you know what? It wasn't as big a deal as it seems. Oftentimes, when we're trying to evaluate our decision options, we are so fearful of failing that we don't act. This is what's known as impact bias. We think no matter what we're going to do, the worst possible thing is going to happen, when the reality is it's never as intense or lasts as long as we think it will be. So you really have to be careful to avoid impact bias and catastrophic thinking. The second enemy of decision making is called confirmation bias and intellectual laziness. We generally tend to seek out information that validates what we already think or how we think things should go. And this is absolutely terrible to do unless you just want to keep doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result. So we have to try to not be intellectually lazy, and it's important to have individuals in your organization who are willing to tell you what your other options are, and you have to have the mental energy and the fortitude to evaluate those options without just looking to confirm what it is you think you should do. It's important to have well-reasoned, thought-out discussion, and it can get heated at times, but you have to take a step back and evaluate all your options and not just rely on what you think you should be doing. The final enemy of decision-making I want to talk about is the Abilene paradox and cowardice. The Abilene paradox, this is a term that was coined, I think, somewhere around the mid-70s. And it's basically, the story is we have a family who lives in Texas, and they're just kind of hanging out at the house, playing a game. And the father thinks that, people look a little bored. So he says, hey, what do y'all think about taking a ride to Abilene for dinner? Abilene is about, an hour or two away. And we're talking about being in South Texas in the middle of summer in the 60s and 70s when they didn't have a whole lot of air conditioning in a car, right? So the father says, let's go grab some dinner in Abilene. The mother says, well, yeah, we could do that, I guess. I'll go as long as, Jimmy, our son, wants to go. And Jimmy says, sure, I'd love to go. But as long as Sue wants to go. And Sue says, well, yeah, sure, I think that's great. So they hop in the car They take the trip to Abilene. It's hot, sweltering. They get there. The food is average at best. And as they're riding back, one of them says, "Boy, that was a great meal in Abilene, wasn't it?" And then everybody kind of looked around and said, "No, it was actually pretty terrible. I actually didn't even really want to go, but I went because you said you wanted to go. And well, I only went because Sue said she wanted to go." When the reality is, no one in the car actually wanted to take that trip. They all just kind of went along with it because they thought that's what everybody else wanted to do. Now, this is an example of cowardice in your organization. You have to be questioning why you're doing things as you are working through your decision-making process. Don't just do it because it's the way we've always done it. And if you don't have the courage to take a look at how you're operating and modify as necessary, you're liable to fall into the Abilene paradox and have a far more inefficient organization. Next slide, please. It's important to have a clearly defined decision-making process, as well as clearly defined delegation of authority for who is allowed to make decisions. If you have an organization where every decision is being made by the leader of that organization, you have a very inefficient organization, and you could be far more effective if you were delegating some of that decision-making authority. With that being said, we have on the screen for you a relatively simple model that can be effective in making good decisions. So you start by figuring out what your problem actually is. And then you want to set aside time to think about your problem. Bring in people that you trust to discuss the issue, focus on options, define what it is you're trying to solve, state your view. Don't be afraid of offending someone. And then everyone work to build consensus on what makes the most sense. Think through it, and then one person makes a decision. That decision stands. Half the room may disagree with that decision, but as you leave that room, every leader that was involved in that process communicates that decision to the rest of the staff as if it was their decision. That helps to build far more trust in your organization. It's also critical that you document your decisions, because as time passes, we may forget why it is we did a certain thing. And it's important that you constantly reflect on those so that you're not overlooking something. By having effective documentation, you may not run into that problem in the future. Next slide, please. Now let's talk a little bit about how we lead and manage the organization at different levels. There are three basic levels of leadership and management. There's a strategic level, there's organizational, then you have a director supervisory, then you have your general workforce. And we're going to dive into each of these three levels in a little more detail. Next slide, please. The highest level is the strategic level. This is the level that's responsible for developing your strategy, your structure, all those highlighted S words, which are on the next slide as well. But we're going to spend a second here talking about strategic level leaders because it can get a little confusing in disaster recovery, depending on what level of grantee you are, whether you're a state level grantee or a county level grantee. You really need to have a single point of leadership and decision-making in your process at the highest level. It gets really, really tricky when you have competing interests. So for example, a county council where 3 members want to do this and 4 members want to do that, that creates a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity in your organization. So your strategic level leader needs to lead up in some situations, but always remember that disaster recovery needs to be an executive function. It does not need to be a legislative function because you're going to end up with very inefficient programs if you're not careful and there are too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to developing your strategy. But let's talk a little bit about the 7 S's on the next slide. The strategic level leader is responsible for figuring out what our shared values are going to be, what the structure of our organization needs to look like to achieve our outcomes, what resources from a staff perspective do we need? Do we have the right people? Do we have them aligned in the right functional areas? What systems are we going to require? Whether that's your general system of record where you document all your case files, whether it's you might need some special finance system, might need some special construction management system. What's the style of my organization going to look like? What's my general strategy going to be? And what skill gaps do we have that we need to work to fill? It's up to the strategic leader to know the answer to all of these questions. So moving from the strategic level of leadership, we now, on the next slide, transition to the organizational level. And these are basically your leaders who lead other leaders. So you're kind of middle managers of an organization. They're not the highest strategic level. They oftentimes will be responsible for providing advice and input on the strategic level of leadership, but their major functional role is planning how to deploy all the resources, organizing all those resources effectively, and then maintaining control throughout the process. The organizational level of leadership needs to be 100% focused on leading toward measurable outcomes. Next slide, please. Then we have the next level, which is kind of the lowest level of leadership. That's going to be your direct or supervisory level. These are the leaders who are responsible for the management and leadership of the work that actually gets done, right? Direct supervision of people, direct supervision of the workflow. You're responsible for making sure folks show up for work when people can't show up for work, figuring out how to manage that workload so that items don't fall through the crack. The direct or supervisory level of leadership is absolutely critical for the enforcement of standards as well as policies and ensuring that work is conducted in a safe manner. And it's important to keep in mind that even if you're at the strategic level or the organizational level, at one point or another, we're all direct leaders in what we do in our organization. If you see something, if you're out on a home visit and you see that something's not happening the way it should be, you have a responsibility as a leader to take corrective action so that you're ensuring the success of your organization. Next slide, please. We like to think that in order to have an effective team, you really have to work towards building what we call the four commons. You want to have a common purpose, common plan, a common process, and a common language. Now, when we talk about common purpose, this is generally we're all working towards the recovery of our communities. When we have a common plan, we have the word plan in a number of different functions here. We have the action plan that all of you are required to complete and submit to HUD that says this is my strategy for how I'm going to spend my money. And then you also have plans for how you're going to go about executing that through having common processes. Everyone in your organization needs to understand what the process looks like and where they fit into that process so that you can have more efficiency and effectiveness. And when I talk about common language, I don't mean we all need to be speaking Spanish or we all need to be speaking English, but if you think about the CDBG-DR world, we are incredibly acronym heavy, right? When I say DOB, many of us will think duplication of benefits. If I talk to somebody who doesn't have a clue what we do and I say DOB, they're going to think of date of birth. So making sure that everyone in your organization understands what the common language is a key to building a cohesive team. And it's absolutely critical as you're onboarding new staff that you're mindful of, how comfortable we all get speaking in this acronym world of disaster recovery. So ensuring that commonality across those four commons will allow you to have a far more effective team. Next slide, please. So in summary, leadership isn't easy. It's by far one of the most important components of having a successful disaster recovery operation is the ability to lead your people to achieve the outcome that you want to achieve. And at the end of the day, your strategy is what matters most. You have to be willing to make hard choices. You need to have a process for making decisions. You need to clearly define who is responsible for making decisions at what particular level. This can get really frustrating at times. If you are at that direct leadership level or even organizational leadership level at some point, you may not know what the limit of your decision-making authority is. You oftentimes don't know where the line is until you actually cross it. So the less ambiguity you can have in who gets to decide what, the more effective your organization is going to be. And I would encourage you to think about evaluating your organization to ensure that you have a common purpose, a common plan, a common process, as well as a common language. At this point, we will open the floor for any questions you might have. And I should point out that J.R. Sanderson from our team is on the call as well, who has 35 or so years experience in leading effective organizations through the context of the United States Army, as well as state government and now the nonprofit world, and who was also willing to chime in with answers to the questions. I see a hand raised, and I don't know how to respond to your hand raise, so hopefully Maria can assist with that. Let's see. Well, feel free to type your question in.
Yes, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box.
I did figure out how to raise my hand, but I didn't figure out how to answer your raised hand. Well, we're available to answer any questions as they come about. We'll move on to the next slide now. I want to take a minute to reiterate some information about our upcoming webinars. We're very excited. We have a new addition to our team at SBP, a gentleman by the name of Josh Bryant, who's really going to hone in on more of the response bleeding into recovery phase of the recovery continuum. With that being said, he's developed a webinar for us called FEMA 101, which he's going to present March 20th, and we hope to have you attend that, as well as one that's about understanding the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program funded through FEMA. Hopefully aligning that webinar with when application period should be opening up so that you can think about trying to apply for those funds if that is a part of your organization. And then he'll also be leading the way for our best practices and mitigation webinar in August. Federal cross-cutting requirements. It's always a huge hit. We are masochists for federal cross-cutting requirements, so we hope to have you join us in July for that as well. And we will close out our webinar series with our common pitfalls in DR. On the next slide, the disaster housing course. Now, we had our first disaster housing course back in December, and it was a huge hit. The reason why I think this course is so valuable is that for the first time, as we've conducted our in-person trainings, we now have a mixed audience. And when I say mixed audience, we bring grantees in who are managing housing programs. We also have contractors in the room who are working for grantees, actually building in the context of a CDBG-DR program. So with this course, we really work to get everybody on the same page about how to streamline your construction process. We start with talking through construction policies. We move into figuring out what a good damage assessment looks like, turning that into a cost of repair, and then having a scope of work and notice to proceed, and how do we kind of contract through all this. In our first iteration back in December, it was really cool to watch the grantees and the contractors kind of butt heads at first and then realize that they could find common ground, because at the end of the day, they're all working towards the same goal. They just have different motivating factors. So that was one of the really cool things that happened with our December course, and we're looking forward to doing it again February 6th through 7th. It's in Savannah, Georgia. It's a paid course. You can see the cost there on the screen, depending on what type of organization you belong to. And if you want to attend that, we have a couple slots still open for the February course. Get in touch with Maria, or you can register on this link, which will be made available in the slides when we send them back out. Next slide, please. And follow us on LinkedIn to keep up with all the fun stuff that we're doing. I don't know about the Facebook side, but I know we're very active on LinkedIn, and we'd love to link up with you. With that, I thank you for your attendance.
Hey, excuse me, Joe.
Yes.
We have a question in the Q&A box.
Hey, all right. Let me see what this question is. All right. How do you approach management you feel fails to make executive decisions, which consistently makes things get dragged for long periods of time? Is it appropriate to fill that void and propose options while collaborating with other stakeholders and force action? It really depends on how risk averse you are as an individual. So I tend to not be very risk averse. So I oftentimes will kind of push the limit. And if I see that there's a vacuum that needs to be filled when it comes to actually making decisions, I go with the old adage that it's usually better to ask for forgiveness than permission. With that being said, if you're wrong or you embarrass somebody, people can get real spiteful. And while it's hard to fire someone in the context of government work, it can still happen. So I would argue that, yes, I think it is important that you work to fill that vacuum and make decisions, because my focus is on helping our disaster impacted survivors get back into their homes. And if the boss isn't doing it, sometimes you got to lead up. JR, you want to chime in with any other words of wisdom when it comes to this? Or
I
did I
don't know if too
overstep my
much.
answer?
Yeah, I don't know if too much wisdom, but what I would say is that you're 100% right. You have to lead up, and oftentimes we find ourselves in the DR world leading our political leaders. What I have found effective is that if you take courses of action to your leaders and say, I can do any one, I can live with all three of these courses of action, but I need you to decide. If you don't decide, here are the consequences of your indecision. So that would be what I would throw at you. I don't know if that's helpful or not, Joe. Your call.
Sounds pretty good to me. Do we have any other questions? And if that didn't properly address what you're trying to get at, feel free to send me an email at jboyes@sbpusa.org, and I promise to allow you to maintain your anonymous status. I won't tell on you for talking to me. Just don't send it from your government email address if you're concerned about that. But I'm happy to help you address that concern offline. All right. Well, I thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you at our next webinar for an overview, FEMA 101 overview. Hope you all have a great day.